Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to add to your knowledge about aggregate demand. Okay, just a quick discussion. Aggregate demand is all about the total demand for goods and services in an economy. It's all about how much consumers, firms, governments, and the overseas sector spend in the economy. Aggregate demand drives economic growth in the short to medium term. That's when it has its impact. The key part of this video is we're going to look at the fact that aggregate demand, this driver of economic growth, has 5 components. So, aggregate demand consists of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. That's the activities of the overseas sector. It's kind of like all the money that's spent on exports minus all the money that's spent on imports, hence net exports. What we're going to do is we're going to explore each of these components in turn. So let's start with consumption. Consumption is so important in determining the level of economic growth. This is because consumption by household is worth about 60% of GDP in the economy. It makes up 60% of GDP. So if consumption is going well, that's a really strong sign for economic growth. If it's not going so well, that's going to be a bit of a drag on economic growth. So let's have a look at what influences consumption, right? So our overall picture is what affects aggregate demand, consumption. Now we're going, what affects consumption? So the first thing that affects consumption in an economy is levels of consumption versus savings. So you might be familiar with this equation. People's income is either spent, consumed, or saved. So if people spend more, that's going to boost aggregate demand more. So next thing we're looking at are consumer expectations. And this is all about price and quantity. So if people expect price is going to go up in the future, they're going to buy now. If people expect that there's going to be less goods in the future, well, they're going to buy, consume now. So this is the kind of relationship we're looking at. So if consumers expect prices will rise in the future and or there will be less goods in the future, they're going to buy now while it's cheaper and there's more of them. The next factor that affects consumption are interest rates. And this is pretty straightforward. The lower the interest rates, the less incentive to save, the more spending. And the final point is about the distribution of income. So this is how income is distributed across the whole economy. If incomes are distributed more equally and people roughly have similar amounts of income, well, then more people are going to be spending that money. Because when income distribution is less equal, when there are many rich people, wealthy people aren't going to spend as much, they're going to save. So that's going to reduce consumption. So if everybody roughly has the same amount of income or similar amounts, that should increase consumption and aggregate demand in an economy. Look, you may not buy that argument, and I understand that. I'm just sharing a little bit of theory for you. So our next point is we're looking at another influence on aggregate demand, and here we're looking at investment. Investment, business investment, is such an important part of driving aggregate demand and changing the level of economic growth. So what affects investment? There are 2 things we need to think about. One is how expensive is capital equipment? Because capital equipment can help produce more goods and services in an economy, help grow the economy. So if it is very cheap to buy capital equipment, then this is going to increase investment. So what are the kinds of things that will affect whether companies buy capital equipment? Okay, so if where I've got this little triangle, that is just the Greek symbol delta for change. Okay, if we look at changes in interest rates, basically the lower the interest rates, the cheaper it is to borrow, so the higher the investment. Let's look at government policies. If government policies are making it easier or cheaper for businesses to invest, well, they're going to increase their investment. So if changing policies, if they favour investment, well, that will increase investment and aggregate demand. Another thing to think about is the changing productivity of labour, because remember, businesses can choose to have more workers or they could have more capital equipment. So what we're looking at here is if labour becomes less productive, well, then it would be better to invest in capital equipment, and that would lead to higher investment in the economy. So if we have less productive labour, well, companies are going to choose capital equipment. Okay, the other thing that's going to affect investment is what do businesses expect, right? So if businesses expect that demand is going to increase for their product, well, then they're going to invest more. The other thing is, if businesses see a really positive economic outlook where things are going to grow and improve, well, then they're more likely to invest as well, and that's more likely to boost aggregate demand. So here we can see how changes in investment will then lead to changes in aggregate demand. Okay, another influence on aggregate demand is government spending and essentially taxation as well, because that relates to government revenue. What we're talking about here is the government will use a mix of G and T to affect the level of aggregate demand and economic growth. How does this work? Can I show you? By increasing spending relative to taxation, the government can stimulate the economy. It can grow economic growth. What a lame expression. It can increase aggregate demand and boost economic growth. But if the government is increasing revenue relative to spending, that's going to slow down the economy. So this would be an option for a government that is trying to rein in economic growth and put the brakes on aggregate demand. Okay, our final influence on aggregate demand are exports and imports. And the two things we're going to look at that affect exports and imports are, so let's start here. If we look at income levels, let's start with domestic income levels. And domestic here means, so if there are higher incomes in Australia, then more people are going to buy imports. They will have that luxury of buying all of those overseas goods because they got extra money. And that could reduce aggregate demand because all that money is going overseas. If we flip it, if there are greater income levels overseas, then that could lead to higher demand for Australia's exports and then boost aggregate demand. And remember, the first Y relates to domestic income and the second is overseas income. Now, the second influence on exports and imports relates to the Australian dollar. So if we've got a higher Australian dollar, a stronger Australian dollar, that means that foreigners are going to have to pay more of their money to buy our exports. So if we have a higher Australian dollar, that's going to make our exports slow. It's going to make them less internationally competitive, as they say, and we're likely to sell less exports. Also, if you've got a stronger dollar, well, we can buy more of those fancy imports. If, on the other hand, we have a lower Australian dollar, well, that means our exports are going to be cheaper for the rest of the world because they need to change less of their currency to buy our goods and services. Also, if our Australian dollar goes lower, well, it's a bit more expensive to buy those fancy imports. So that's likely to decline. So here we can see how changes in exports and imports due to income levels and exchange rates can then affect aggregate demand. So in this video, we've looked at this formula. Aggregate demand equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. All of these components affect aggregate demand and then affect economic growth. But don't stop here. Watch some more videos. Subscribe. Leave a comment. That's probably about it. Thanks for your time.